The sound of the lake at night was supposed to be soothing. A soft rhythm of ripples lapping against the wooden dock, an occasional frog calling from the reeds. But on the evening of that summer in the early 1980s, the quiet carried something else, something missing. It was the summer of year 1983 in the pine-clad hills of northern Minnesota, where the forests seemed endless and the air smelled faintly of resin and rain. Camp Clearwater had been running for decades, a place where children from across the Midwest came to spend their days swimming, hiking, and learning the unspoken rules of the woods. Among the campers that year were Ethan and Lucas Vance, 14-year-old identical twins from Minneapolis. They had the easy charm of boys raised in a close, busy neighborhood, the kind of kids who could turn strangers into friends before lunch. Ethan was the talker, his voice always a little louder than it needed to be, his hands always moving as if words alone weren't enough. Lucas was quieter, but not shy. He watched before speaking, noticing things his brother missed. Their parents had sent them to Camp Clearwater partly for the adventure, partly for the hope that 2 months in the wild would give them a taste of independence before high school. For the first 2 weeks, the twins fit perfectly into the rhythm of camp life. They rose with the bugle, swam in the shockingly cold lake, and told ghost stories with the other boys in Cabin 7. But it was the 3rd week, the night of the short hike challenge, that would change everything. The tradition was simple. After dinner, the campers would hike in small groups into the edge of the forest, spend about an hour exploring, and return before curfew. It was meant to build confidence, a taste of the outdoors without the safety net of counselors at every turn. On July 17th, Ethan and Lucas set out with flashlights, a canteen, and a small compass they'd borrowed from the camp gear room. They told the boys from their cabin they wanted to find the old maple with the face in it, a tree rumored to look like a man's head when lit from the right angle. It was just before sunset when they left the main path, laughing and shoving each other like always. The forest swallowed them in minutes. An hour later, when the other campers had returned, the twins had not. At first, no one worried. Ethan was known for pushing limits, and Lucas usually followed. But as the night deepened and the flashlights, bobbing back toward camp, stopped appearing through the trees, a murmur of unease began to spread. By 10 o'clock, the counselors had formed search parties. By midnight, the county sheriff was called. And by dawn, the forest echoed with the sound of dogs and voices shouting the boys' names. For 3 days, teams combed the woods around the camp. Volunteers, law enforcement, and even National Guard units scoured the undergrowth, checked the lake's shoreline, and dragged parts of the water. The search spread outward in rings, but no footprints, no scraps of clothing, no signs of a struggle were found. It was as if Ethan and Lucas had stepped into the trees and vanished. Theories sprouted quickly. Some whispered about a reclusive man who lived deep in the woods. The trapper, a shadowy figure seen only at a distance. Others suggested the boys had run away, though no one could explain why they would leave behind their belongings, their money, and their favorite, baseball caps. By the end of the first week, the mood at Camp Clearwater had shifted from anxious hope to something heavier, an awareness that the forest could hold its secrets far longer than any human could wait. The FBI joined the case on the 4th day, citing the possibility of abduction. Agents interviewed every camper, every counselor, and every local within a 10-mile radius. A few campers claimed they had heard laughter in the distance that night, not playful laughter, but sharp, quick, like someone stifling it. Another boy swore he'd seen a light moving between the trees, where there should have been none, but the detail was dismissed as imagination. The boys' parents arrived on the 2nd day, exhausted from the drive and hollow-eyed with fear. They stayed in a small guest cabin near the camp office, pacing the porch at all hours, jumping at every radio crackle from the search teams. Weeks passed. Summer slipped toward autumn. The search was scaled back, then suspended. Without bodies, without evidence, the case became a file in the FBI's Minneapolis office, marked unresolved. Camp Clearwater reopened the following summer. The Vance family never returned. Ethan and Lucas became names that hovered in campfire stories, reminders of the hike that ended without an ending. As the years turned to decades, the forest reclaimed whatever might have been left. New counselors came, the old ones moved on, and the twins' disappearance settled into the strange half-life of cold cases. Remembered, but without motion. 40 years later, in the summer of year 2023, the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources began a routine project to remove deadfall in a section of forest less than a mile from Camp Clearwater's old boundary. The area had been untouched for years, marked on maps as Ecological Preservation Zone. One humid afternoon, a crew member's chainsaw bit into the base of a massive fallen oak, revealing something unusual beneath, a patch of earth darker than the soil around it, and the faint outline of something man-made. They called in the county sheriff. The sheriff called the FBI, and within 24 hours, a small excavation was underway. What emerged was a weathered, half-collapsed backpack, its fabric so rotted it had fused with the dirt. Inside were scraps of clothing, faded denim, a flannel shirt missing 2 buttons, and, wrapped in a plastic bag that had miraculously survived the decades, a pocket knife engraved with the initials EV. The forensic team also found a fragment of a wristwatch and a single sneaker, its rubber sole cracked and brittle, and then, beneath the backpack, partially shielded by roots, something far more chilling, a handful of small, brittle bones. DNA testing would take time, but the preliminary measurements matched the size of a young teenage boy. As the evidence was cataloged and sealed, one agent noticed something else. A strip of cloth wedged deep in the soil, stained a color that might once have been red. It didn't match the boy's reported clothing from that night. When they pulled it free, a slip of paper fluttered out from its folds, so degraded it was nearly unreadable. The handwriting, however, was unmistakably human. The last 2 words were still clear. Don't follow. The meaning of the message, and the question of who it was meant for, would pull the investigation into a direction no one at the FBI was ready for. The paper was as fragile as moth wings, its edges crumbling at the slightest touch. But those 2 words, don't follow, refused to fade, as if the forest had preserved them out of some grim respect for the warning they carried. The note was sent to the FBI's laboratory in Quantico, but it offered few new clues. The ink, degraded by decades in the soil, revealed nothing about the pen that wrote it. The fibers in the paper were ordinary for the 1980s, and the handwriting, jagged, hurried, didn't match any samples from the camps, staff, or registered visitors. Still, those 2 words changed the tone of the investigation. If the twins had been running from something that night, someone, or something, had known, and that someone had left a message that had waited 40 years to be read. Special Agent Daniel Reeves, a veteran of cold cases, was assigned to lead the reopened investigation. Reeves was a patient man, the kind who didn't believe in coincidences. He requested every scrap of documentation from the original search, maps, interview transcripts, photographs, and began retracing the twins' last known steps. The old camp had been abandoned since the late 1990s, its buildings left to rot under the weight of snow and time. Reeves and his team walked the overgrown trails, following the route the boys had reportedly taken on the night they vanished. A mile in, the woods thickened. Even in daylight, the canopy closed so tightly that sunlight reached the forest floor in thin, pale strips. It was here, in this oppressive green tunnel, that Reeves noticed something, an unnatural clearing, ringed with stones. They were covered, in moss now, but beneath the growth, faint scorch marks spread like shadows. When the old counselors were shown photographs, A few remembered a local legend that the clearing had been used for midnight fires by older campers decades earlier. But no one could explain why the stones seemed deliberately arranged in a rough spiral. Among the names in the original case file was a man named Henry Collier, now in his late 60s. In year 1983, he had been a seasonal maintenance worker at Camp Clearwater. His statement back then had been brief. He'd seen nothing, heard nothing unusual. When Reeves tracked him down to a nursing home outside Duluth, Collier's memory was brittle but intact. At first, he denied remembering anything new. But after several visits and after Reeves mentioned the note, Collier grew uneasy. "There was something," he said finally, his voice a rasp. "The night the boys went missing, I saw a light in the woods. Not a flashlight. Bigger. Warmer. Like a fire, but too high off the ground. I went to look, but I heard them. Running. Twigs snapping. Breathing hard. And then a voice, not yelling. Talking. Low, but angry." Collier swallowed hard. "I didn't follow. I don't think they wanted me to." Back at Quantico, the forensic report came in. The bones found beneath the backpack belonged to Ethan Vance. But there were fewer bones than expected, only fragments from one arm and part of the rib cage. The rest of the remains were missing. More. Troubling still, microscopic soil analysis suggested the site where the backpack was found had been disturbed twice, once in the early 1980s, and again approximately a decade later. Someone had returned. If Ethan's remains were... Here, where was Lucas? Reeves considered the possibility that the note had been left for Lucas, a desperate warning from Ethan or from someone else entirely. But handwriting analysis suggested the writer was older than 14, based on stroke pressure and letter formation. That meant the note had likely come from an adult. The FBI began canvassing former staff and campers, piecing together a web of relationships that had frayed over the years. Several names surfaced in multiple interviews. One in particular, Raymond Ray Holbrook, a counselor in his 20s at the time, known for leading unsanctioned night hikes. Holbrook had left the state shortly after the twins' disappearance. When agents located him in rural Idaho, he seemed startled by their visit, but agreed to talk. "I remember those boys," Holbrook said, his gaze drifting. "They were curious, always asking about the old parts of the forest, the places we didn't take campers." When asked why, Holbrook hesitated. "Because not everything in those woods belonged to the camp." Weeks into the investigation, an evidence technician sorting through the original case materials found a folded map tucked into the back of a file folder. It was hand-drawn, marked with trails, symbols, and a red X, far from the main paths. The handwriting matched neither the note nor any of the official search maps. Reeves and his team hiked to the marked location. The forest grew denser with each step, the air cooler. At the site, they found the remains of an old wooden structure, barely more than a skeleton of beams now. Inside the rotting frame lay a metal box, rusted shut. When the box was forced open, the contents were disturbing. A bundle of children's clothing from different eras, each piece neatly folded. A handful of Polaroids so faded they were nearly blank. And, in the bottom corner, a set of metal tags engraved with initials, not just EV, but at least 4 other combinations. The discovery shifted the investigation into darker territory. Reeves began to suspect the twins had not been random victims, but part of a pattern stretching back decades. But without more direct evidence, the theory was dangerous to voice. The team sent the metal tags for fingerprint and chemical analysis, hoping for a breakthrough. Meanwhile, they re-examined Collier's testimony. The spiral of stones, the high-off-the-ground fire, the angry voice. It all pointed to a gathering of some kind. Holbrook, when confronted with these details, became visibly uncomfortable. "You don't understand," he told Reeves quietly. "Some of the older staff, They had their own traditions. Things the camp director didn't know about. Things you were better off not asking about. When pressed, Holbrook refused to elaborate. But as the agents left, he called after them. "If you find Lucas, don't expect him to be the same. Late." In the autumn of year 2023, a hiker reported stumbling across bones deep in the forest, miles from the first site. The remains were scattered, weathered by decades of exposure. Forensic analysis confirmed they belonged to Lucas Vance. But something was wrong. The bones showed signs of having been moved multiple times, and near the site, buried in a shallow depression, was another note. This one almost perfectly preserved, in a glass jar. It read, the message sent a chill through the investigative team. If Lucas had written it, and handwriting analysis suggested he might have, then at least one of the twins had survived for some time after the night they vanished. But with whom? And why had they both ultimately died? Reeves stood in the cold autumn air, the note in his gloved hand, and felt the forest pressing in around him. The trees whispered in the wind, and for a moment he imagined them speaking in voices not heard in 40 years. Somewhere out here, he thought, the truth was still waiting, and it had waited long enough. Even now, as the FBI pieces together the fragments of that summer, one question refuses to fade. If the twins were not alone, who, or what, was with them in those woods? And perhaps the more dangerous question, is it still there?